Title: I crash-landed on a medieval world and met a fox-girl warrior. Part 3. Adventuring in a medieval world with my fox-girl warrior wife. 5 years had changed everything. What had once been a village of 500 scattered around rough wooden homes had become a thriving town of 5,000, enclosed by stone walls and watched over by the 8 towering guardians that gave the settlement its new name, the Town of 8 Guardians. Wide roads of packed stones spread from the gates like spokes on a wheel, connecting distant villages and merchant routes that had never existed before Edward's arrival. New workshops lined the inner streets, smithies, mills, granaries, and schools, while wagons carrying iron, lumber, and grain rolled through the gates from dawn until dusk. The greatest change, however, was not the roads or walls. It was the children. Inside the large stone academy near the town center, children of human, vulpine, lupin, and feline families sat together at polished wooden desks, learning mathematics, medicine, engineering, and history from 10 shimmering holographic teachers Edward had created from his overpowered 3D printer. Lessons once impossible in this world were now taught daily, giving the next generation knowledge equal to 20th century Earth. For the older students, those nearing adulthood, the education did not stop at books. Edward had recruited retired and semi-retired masters, blacksmiths, engineers, farmers, masons, carpenters, and healers, to train them in practical trades. His reasoning had been simple. A town could survive on walls. A civilization survived on knowledge. At the western training yard, beyond the academy, the sound of clashing practice swords rang through the afternoon air. Ven stood calmly with his spear planted beside him, his white tail swaying behind him as he watched his students spar. Though years had passed, he still carried himself like a silent mountain, unmoved, patient, and impossible to surprise. In front of him, Eric and Petra circled each other with wooden practice swords. Eric, the son of Edward and Yuki, had grown quickly in 5 years. His mixed heritage gave him his mother's sharp vulpine ears and tail, but his father's eyes, calm, observant, and always thinking. He moved with surprising discipline for someone so young, keeping his blade up exactly as Ven had taught him. Petra moved opposite him, dark-haired with black wolf ears twitching as she watched his every step. She was slightly shorter than Eric but far more aggressive, her attacks quick and direct, forcing him back across the yard. Their wooden blades clacked together repeatedly until Petra suddenly stepped inside his guard. Instead of striking, she leaned forward and bit Eric lightly on the forearm. Eric yelped in surprise and stumbled backward, while Petra calmly stepped away as if nothing unusual had happened. At that exact moment, Edward walked into the training yard, having come to collect the 2 children before the afternoon academy lessons began. He stopped mid-step, blinking once. Then he looked at Ven. "That's the 3rd time I've seen Petra bite Eric this week." Ven's ears twitched. Edward crossed his arms, raising an eyebrow. "What exactly does that mean in Wolfkin culture?" For a moment, Ven said nothing. Then the usually stoic foxman let out a sudden laugh, the sound so unexpected that even the children turned to stare at him. His tail flicked once as he shook his head. "In adult Wolfkin culture, biting like that is a show of affection." Edward stared. Ven's grin widened. "And in many cases, a claim of romantic interest." Edward slowly turned toward Petra, who now looked absolutely unashamed of herself, standing proudly with her practice sword in hand. Then laughed again, this time louder. "It would seem Eric has his first suitor." Edward covered his face with one hand. Petra's tail wagged once behind her. Then smirked. "And a very strong one at that. She is the only student I have who can keep pace with him." He glanced toward the wolf girl, then added with clear amusement, "She reminds me very much of Yuki when she was younger." From behind Edward, a familiar voice answered immediately. "That explains why I like her." Yuki had arrived silently behind him, carrying a basket of fresh bread from the market, and was now smiling far too knowingly at the scene before her. Edward sighed. This was going to be a long day. Edward stayed quiet for a moment longer, still half covering his face as if that might somehow undo what he had just heard. Behind him, Yuki stepped closer, peering past his shoulder with an amused tilt of her head. She's efficient, she said simply, as if that explained everything. It explains too much, Edward muttered. Ven was still chuckling under his breath, clearly enjoying this far more than he should have. Eric, meanwhile, was rubbing his forearm and glaring at Petra with a mix of confusion and embarrassment. Petra, entirely unbothered, stood tall like she had just won a formal duel instead of whatever that was. Edward exhaled slowly and forced himself back into focus. All right, he said at last, lowering his hand. Training ends in 10 minutes. Eric, Petra, clean up. You've got academy work. Petra nodded instantly. Eric opened his mouth, thought better of it, and just nodded too. Edward turned away from the yard, already mentally shifting gears. Because Petra's cultural enthusiasm wasn't actually what was bothering him. It was what he had been thinking about before he even arrived. Edward stood at the academy entrance, watching Eric and Petra disappear into the stone building as the lesson bell rang. Petra was still walking far too close to Eric for his comfort, her black wolf tail swaying smugly behind her, as she whispered something that made his ears turn bright red again. Yuki noticed and smiled. Edward barely did. Because his mind had already gone somewhere else, to something he had built 3 years earlier, long before the northern road had gone silent. A precaution. An indulgence. And if he was being honest, the greatest excuse for adventure he had ever created. 3 years earlier. Deep beneath their home, hidden under stone, steel, and several layers of doors no one in the town could open without Edward, the workshop hummed with the soft blue light of the overpowered 3D printer. It had been running for almost 48 hours straight. On the main fabrication platform sat 5 perfect metallic spheres. Each was just over 3 feet in diameter, polished silver black, smooth as glass, and seamless except for faint circular lines running across their surfaces like hidden panels waiting to open. They floated 6 inches above the platform, completely silent. Yuki walked slowly around them with her hands behind her back, staring at the nearest one. Then she reached out and tapped it with one finger. It responded by rotating in place and emitting a soft chime. Yuki immediately grinned. So this one likes me more. Edward did not look up from the holographic console. It is not alive. That sounds jealous. Edward sighed. I'm calibrating orbital insertion trajectories. Yuki leaned over the console from behind him, chin nearly resting on his shoulder. You made 5 floating metal balls and launched them into the sky in your notes. I'm allowed to call them toys? They're satellites. She looked at the hovering spheres. They look like expensive eggs. Edward pinched the bridge of his nose. I married a comedian. She kissed his cheek and smiled. No, you married a fox. The comedy came free. That got a reluctant laugh out of him. He touched the console, and a 3-dimensional globe sprang into existence above the workbench. It rotated slowly, showing the entire planet in pale blue holographic detail, continents, oceans, mountain chains, polar ice caps. Yuki's playful expression softened. Even after years of seeing impossible things from Edward's machines, the sight still made her pause. The globe zoomed outward, and 5 orbital trajectories appeared around it. Edward finally turned to face the spheres. These will map everything. Yuki crossed her arms. Everything? He nodded. Every continent. Every ocean. Underground structures. Mineral deposits. Hidden settlements. Ancient ruins. Rare plants. Unusual biological signatures. Anything worth finding. Her ears perked up. Treasure? Edward gave her a look. Yes, treasure. That made her tail wag. The nearest sphere unfolded silently. Panels separated like petals, revealing an inner core of intricate machinery, rotating rings, microscopic drone ports, telescopic sensor lenses, and a central blue core pulsing like a contained star. Yuki's eyes widened. All right, not eggs. Edward smiled faintly. Each one has a perpetual energy core. She looked at him. Which means? He enlarged a schematic. Inside each sphere, several miniature systems rotated around a central axis. A gravitic differential generator that converted the planet's gravity well into continuous mechanical energy. A microfusion backup core for startup and emergency reserve. Thermal exchange harvesters that drew energy from atmospheric friction and solar radiation. Self-repair nanofabricators fed by stored raw material reservoirs and atmospheric particle collection. Yuki stared for several seconds. Then she blinked. So, they eat gravity. Edward hesitated. That is not technically wrong. She looked very proud of herself. The 5 satellites were not just cameras in the sky. Each had specialized scanning arrays far beyond anything this world could imagine. Their capabilities: planetary topographic mapping, creating a complete high-resolution map of the world over 3 years, subsurface resonance scans, detecting buried ruins, underground rivers, caves, tombs, cities, and hidden structures miles below the surface, biological identification systems, cataloging plant species, animal populations, and rare organisms, chemical spectroscopy, identifying useful compounds in plants, soils, and water for medicines, dyes, industrial chemicals, and food, preservation, mineral detection arrays, locating veins of iron, silver, copper, rare earth elements, gemstones, sulfur, oil, natural gas, and unknown alloys, thermal and motion tracking, locating settlements hidden by forests, storms, mountains, or underground, historical anomaly scans, identifying artificial geometric structures that suggested lost civilizations, targeted life sign pattern recognition, searching for unusual individuals, powerful beings, or anyone whose biological signature stood outside normal ranges. Yuki raised one eyebrow. You're spying on the whole world. Edward folded his arms. I'm preparing. She grinned. For adventure. He paused. Then gave in. Yes. Also for adventure. That earned a triumphant smile. The launch chamber ceiling above them split open, revealing the night sky. Cold air rushed into the workshop. The 5 spheres rose together. As they floated upward, their outer shells shifted, revealing stabilizing rings and silent gravitic thrusters. Yuki looked up at them. How long before they finish? Edward checked the calculations. 3 years for complete planetary survey and classification. She blinked. Then slowly turned to him. So you're saying you built 5 immortal flying treasure hunters, and then we have to wait 3 years? Edward nodded. She narrowed her eyes. That's rude. The first sphere launched. There was no fire. No explosion. Only a deep hum that shook the walls for a heartbeat before it shot into the sky like a silver star. Then the second. Then the third. Then all 5 vanished into the upper atmosphere, leaving faint blue trails that disappeared among the stars. Yuki leaned into Edward's side as they watched the sky. Then she smirked. If one of those comes back with a crown, I'm keeping it. Edward smiled. If one comes back with a dragon, you're handling it. She looked at him, utterly unbothered. Only if I can name it. Present day. 3 years had passed. The satellites had completed their first global survey. In Edward's private study, the holographic globe now filled half the room, rotating slowly in the dim light. The world was no longer unknown. It was mapped in astonishing detail. Thousands of markers glowed across the continents. Ancient ruins, buried fortresses, sunken cities, massive cave systems, rare medicinal forests, or fields rich enough to build empires, volcanic chambers, abandoned roads older than recorded history, underground lakes beneath mountains, entire forgotten cities beneath the desert sands, and one marker pulsed brighter than all the others. Far to the north, beyond the frozen mountain ranges, a red icon buried beneath a glacier. Edward enlarged it. A report appeared beside the hologram. Subsurface artificial structure detected. Depth, 2,817 meters beneath glacial ice. Estimated size, 46 square kilometers. Internal heat source active. Unidentified life signs present. Surface access tunnels located. Origin unknown. Priority highest. The study door opened quietly. Yuki stepped inside wearing heavy winter gear over her white and gold armor, snow cloak draped over one arm. She saw the red marker and smiled immediately. Not nervous. Excited. She walked beside him and looked at the projection. Then she tilted her head. Did one of your sky balls finally find treasure? Edward closed the report. It found something. Her tail swayed. Something dangerous? He nodded once. That only made her smile wider. She reached for her sword belt. Good. Edward stared at her. She met his look innocently. What? You built 5 immortal flying treasure hunters. It would be disappointing if the first real discovery was just another cave full of rocks. He laughed despite himself, grabbed his winter coat, and shut down the hologram. The room went dark. And in the frozen north, beneath miles of ancient ice, something hidden for thousands of years was waiting for them. Edward was still staring at the pulsing red marker above his desk when he finally exhaled and shut the hologram down. The room dimmed, lit only by the soft lantern near the window. Outside, the evening wind brushed against the stone walls of their home, carrying the distant sounds of the town settling for the night. Yuki was already halfway to the door, clearly ready to leave that very moment. Edward smiled faintly and shook his head. Not yet. Yuki stopped and looked back at him, one ear flicking. What do you mean, not yet? You said ancient hidden structure under the ice. That means adventure. Adventure means we leave now. Edward crossed his arms. It also means freezing to death if we walk into the northern glacier unprepared. She blinked once. Then smiled sheepishly. Ah. Right. That part. Edward walked past her toward the lower workshop. There are a few things I need to make before we go north. Yuki followed immediately, curious. As they descended the spiral stone stairs into the hidden fabrication chamber, Edward began listing items aloud while the overpowered 3D printer powered up with its familiar blue glow. First, thermal weather control belts. Yuki tilted her head. The name sounds boring. They'll keep our body temperature regulated between 70 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit no matter how cold it gets. Her ears shot straight up. I like that name now. Edward smirked. Second, ice cleats for our boots. Micro-spike traction grips so we won't slip on frozen surfaces. Useful. Third, adaptive snow shoes. They'll distribute our weight across deep drifts. Yuki nodded seriously. Very useful. Edward touched the console again, and a new blueprint appeared. And fourth. The printer's internal lights brightened. A molecular agitation gun. Yuki stared. That sounds dangerous. It's basically a directed resonance emitter. It agitates molecular bonds in ice, instantly melting anything in a 10-foot area where it's aimed. Her tail wagged slowly. I definitely like that one. The printer began its work, layer by impossible layer, producing sleek devices from advanced alloys and synthetic composites this world had no words for. Within an hour, everything was laid out on the workbench. 2 dark silver belts with temperature regulation cores embedded into the buckles. Detachable cleats for boots. Wide folding snow shoes reinforced with ultralight ala frames. And a compact rifle-like device with a blue crystal lens at the front, the molecular agitation gun. Yuki picked it up carefully. It hums. Edward took it from her immediately. That means don't point it at the house. She gave him an innocent look. I wasn't going to. Edward looked at her. She grinned. Probably. Once the travel equipment was packed, Edward moved to the weapon rack. His expression became more serious. He lifted his staff from its resting mount. The weapon looked deceptively simple, a dark metallic rod just taller than he was, smooth and unadorned except for faint engraved lines running along its shaft. But beneath that plain exterior was one of the most absurd things he had ever printed. He activated the internal diagnostic. A holographic readout appeared. Impact force, 10 tons baseline. Inertia amplification, active. Maximum multiplier, x10. Current status, nominal. Edward gave it a test swing through the air. The staff emitted a low thrum that made the floor vibrate. Yuki whistled softly. That thing still terrifies me. Edward rested it on his shoulder. That's the point. Next, he turned to Yuki's gear. She unfastened her sword and handed it to him. The blade shimmered silver blue under the workshop lights, the monomolecular edge still almost invisible. Edward ran a diagnostic scan across it. Perfect. Edge integrity is unchanged. It'll still cut through pretty much anything. Yuki smiled proudly. I told you I'd take care of it. Then he checked her shield. At first glance it looked like a polished round shield of silver steel, but the embedded gravitic repulsion system hidden inside gave it far more power than any normal defensive tool. He activated a test cycle. A faint pulse expanded outward, rattling tools on the workbench. Repulsion field active. Kinetic discharge operational. Projected shield bash force, sufficient to knock 5 attackers 10 feet. Yuki gave it an approving nod. Good. I like when they fly. Edward laughed despite himself and set the shield down. By the time they returned upstairs, their gear was packed and ready. The house was quiet except for the soft sound of little feet running across the hall. A moment later, Eric appeared carrying one of his school books under his arm. He looked between them and immediately noticed the travel packs. His fox ears perked. Are we going somewhere? Yuki knelt and smiled. Your father and I need to travel north for a little while. Eric's ears lowered slightly. How long? Edward crouched to meet his son's eyes. About 2 weeks. Maybe less. Eric looked disappointed, but he nodded. He had grown enough to understand when something serious was happening. Yuki gently brushed his hair back. We thought you could stay with your grandparents while we're gone. At that, Eric brightened immediately. Grandma Trixie and Grandpa Ven? Edward smiled. I know Trixie and Ven will be very happy with that. Yuki laughed. I agree. Especially because he'll probably talk Ven into extra spear practice. Eric puffed his chest proudly. I'm getting better. Edward stood and ruffled his hair. I know you are. A short while later, the three of them walked through the evening streets of the town of 8 Guardians. Lanterns glowed along the stone roads. Merchants were closing their stalls, and townsfolk waved as Edward and Yuki passed. Eric walked between them, holding Yuki's hand while carrying a small pack of clothes over his shoulder like he was far older than his years. They soon reached the quiet western district where Van and Trixie's home stood. It was a large stone house near the training grounds, built with a broad yard and a covered porch. Light spilled warmly from the windows. Edward knocked once. The door opened almost immediately. Trixie stood there, and the moment she saw Eric, her face lit up. Eric! She scooped him into a hug before anyone could say a word. From deeper inside the house, Ven stepped into view, and even the stoic foxman's ears perked slightly. Edward smiled. We have a favor to ask. Trixie looked between the packed gear on Edward and Yuki and immediately understood. Her expression turned serious. You're leaving. Edward nodded. There's something in the north that needs to be investigated. We'll be gone around 2 weeks. Then stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. The satellite discovery? Edward paused, then gave a single nod. Ven was one of the few people he trusted with that knowledge. The older warrior crossed his arms. You think it may be dangerous? Yuki answered this time, her tail swaying once. We're assuming yes. Trixie tightened her hold on Eric and smiled softly. He'll stay here. Don't worry. Eric looked entirely unbothered now, already distracted by the smell of fresh stew from the kitchen. Then placed one hand on Edward's shoulder. Then go. We'll watch the town. And your son? Edward nodded once. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Yuki leaned toward Trixie and whispered just loud enough for Edward to hear. If Petra visits, try not to let her bite Eric too much. Trixie froze. Then coughed to hide a laugh. Edward covered his face with one hand. And Eric shouted from inside the house. Mom! Yuki's innocent smile made it very clear she had absolutely no regrets. Morning came with a pale gray sky and a sharp wind rolling down from the northern mountains. Snow had not yet reached the town of 8 Guardians, but the air carried the promise of it. At first light, Edward and Yuki stood at the hidden launch yard beyond the western wall, their travel packs secured and winter cloaks fastened over their armor. The destination was far beyond anything that could be reached on horseback. The ancient structure buried under the glacier lay nearly 3,000 miles to the north, across forests, mountain chains, frozen plains, and lands no one in the town of 8 Guardians had ever seen. So they were not taking ordinary horses. The workshop doors opened with a deep metallic rumble, and 2 mechanical mounts stepped into the morning light. Each stood as tall as a warhorse, built with sleek black alloy plating over an internal framework of synthetic muscle and reinforced joints. Their eyes glowed a calm blue, and faint streams of vapor escaped from vents along their necks as their internal systems warmed. They moved with uncanny smoothness, too graceful to be mistaken for simple machines. Yuki's face lit up immediately. She walked straight to hers and stroked its metallic neck. "I still love these." Edward smiled faintly. The robotic horses had been one of his earliest large-scale creations, originally intended for long-range scouting and cargo transport. But after years of improvements, they had become something else entirely. Each mount could run for weeks without rest, carried an internal gravitic stabilizer for mountain climbing, and had limited flight capability, enough to cross ravines, cliffs, and long stretches of dangerous terrain by lifting several hundred feet into the air and gliding at high speed. Perfect for a 3,000-mile journey. Yuki swung onto her mount with practiced ease. Edward mounted his own and activated the control harness. The 2 machines straightened, their hoof assemblies shifting into adaptive terrain mode. Before they moved, a familiar voice spoke from the communication devices built into their belts. Warm. Calm. Artificial. "Good journey, my friends." Yuki smiled immediately. "Morning, Lucy." Lucy was the central artificial intelligence Edward had built into the hidden workshop systems years earlier, an ever-present companion who managed the printer, monitored the town's infrastructure, and coordinated the satellite network. Her voice continued through the small earpiece. "I will maintain regular communication as usual. The satellites are monitoring your progression, weather conditions, and terrain hazards. You are currently on the safest projected route." Edward adjusted the reins. "Anything interesting between here and the destination?" There was a brief pause. Then Lucy answered. "Yes. Approximately 1,500 miles along your route, I have identified a city previously unknown to regional maps." A holographic marker appeared above Edward's wrist display. "It appears to be inhabited primarily by a species comparable to what Old Earth classified as elves." Yuki's ears perked instantly. "Elves?" Lucy responded in the same calm tone. "Correct. Tall humanoids, extended lifespans, pointed ears, advanced stone architecture, and high concentrations of arboreal settlements. Population estimate, 42,000. Yuki leaned over from her saddle, eyes sparkling. "Elvish people are supposed to be very nice looking." Edward gave her a sidelong glance. "That's what you took from that?" She ignored him completely and smiled. Then her expression changed into something mischievous. She moved her robotic horse closer until their knees nearly touched. Then she pointed one finger at him very seriously. "Don't let any elf girls touch you." Edward blinked. "What?" Her tail swished behind her as she leaned closer. "I mean it. No touching." He stared at her. "You realize you're saying this while literally holding my arm?" She looked down. She was. At some point during the conversation, she had unconsciously wrapped one arm around his. Instead of letting go, she tightened her hold and smiled smugly. "That's different. I'm your wife. They're suspiciously graceful strangers." Edward laughed. Yuki had always been playful, always teasing, but over the years she had also grown more openly affectionate, especially after Eric was born. She still carried herself like a capable warrior, but whenever they were alone or traveling together, she had a habit of staying just a little too close. And Edward loved every second of it. He leaned over and kissed the top of her head between her ears. You're impossible. She looked entirely pleased with herself. Yes. But I'm your impossible. Lucy's voice returned, perfectly timed. Wind conditions favorable. If you depart now and maintain flight-assisted pace, estimated arrival at the Elven City, 3 days, 12 hours. Yuki sat upright immediately and pointed north dramatically. Then onward before the elf girls hear you're handsome. Edward shook his head, smiling, and gave the command. The robotic horses surged forward. They galloped across the open fields west of the town, hoofs striking the ground with metallic precision. As the stone walls of the town of 8 guardians faded behind them, the mounts reached the edge of a high ridgeline. Edward activated flight mode. Panels along the horses' sides unfolded, revealing compact gravitic emitters. With a deep hum, both machines leapt from the ridge. Instead of falling, they soared. The ground dropped away beneath them as the mechanical mounts glided into the morning sky, carrying Edward and Yuki northward over endless forests and distant mountain peaks. Yuki laughed into the wind, one hand gripping the saddle and the other still holding on to Edward's arm as though she had no intention of letting go. Far above them, invisible in the blue sky, one of Edward's satellites shifted its orbit slightly to keep them centered in its sensors. And 1,500 miles ahead, hidden among ancient silver forests, a city of elegant towers and crystal bridges waited, its people entirely unaware that 2 travelers from a distant town were already on their way. By the time the sun dipped below the western mountains, Edward and Yuki had already covered hundreds of miles. Their robotic horses had carried them across rolling forests, frozen rivers, and rugged hills that no normal caravan could have crossed in a week. By late evening, the land beneath them had begun to change. The forest grew denser, the air colder, and the distant peaks to the north shimmered white under the fading light. Edward guided his mount down into a small clearing near the edge of a pine forest, sheltered by a rocky slope that blocked the wind. The machines landed smoothly, folding their gravitic emitters back into their sides as they settled onto the snow-dusted ground. Yuki slid off first, stretching with a soft sigh. That was fun. Edward raised an eyebrow. We were traveling at over 100 miles per hour. She smiled. Yes. Fun. While Yuki gathered firewood, Edward unpacked the compact shelter unit from his travel bag. What looked like a small metal cylinder unfolded in seconds into a sturdy insulated tent large enough for both of them, its fabric reinforced against snow and wind. Once the tent was secured, Edward walked the perimeter of the clearing and placed 4 small disc-shaped devices into the snow at equal intervals. As each one activated, faint blue lights flashed once and disappeared. Yuki returned carrying a bundle of branches and tilted her head. The warning system? Edward nodded. Motion sensors, heat detection, and directional alarm pulses. If anything larger than a rabbit gets within 100 yards, we'll know. She smiled. So I can sleep without worrying about giant snow monsters? He looked at her. I didn't say there aren't giant snow monsters. She stared for a moment, then narrowed her eyes. You waited until after I agreed to come north to mention that. Edward was grinning now. That may have been strategic. Yuki tossed the pinecone at him. After dinner, the fire crackled warmly in the center of the clearing. The sky above was clear, revealing a sea of stars unlike anything visible from the town. The pale moonlight reflected off the thin snow, making the forest shimmer silver-blue around them. Edward and Yuki sat together on a fallen log near the fire. Yuki had shifted close enough that her shoulder pressed against his, her thick winter cloak draped partly over both of them. She leaned into him comfortably, her tail wrapped around his leg for warmth. For a long while, neither said anything. The quiet felt easy. Then Yuki spoke, her voice softer than usual. When we dropped Eric off. Edward looked at her. She smiled faintly, still watching the fire. Ven and Trixie said something before we left? Edward waited. Yuki's ears flicked once, and there was amusement in her voice. They said, as much as we love Eric, we want more grandchildren. Edward blinked. Then laughed quietly. That sounds like Trixie. Yuki smiled wider. She glanced at him. And then Ben said a lot more? Edward raised an eyebrow. What did he say? Yuki's tail swayed once behind her. She tried to mimic Ven's deep, serious voice. He said the town is strong. The roads are safe. The academy runs itself half the time. You two have no excuse not to produce at least 3 more. Edward stared at her. Then he laughed so hard he had to lean forward, covering his face. That sounds exactly like him. Yuki nodded, smiling. And then he laughed. That made Edward laugh even more, because the image of stoic, mountain-like Ven delivering that line with complete seriousness was far too easy to imagine. When his laughter settled, Edward looked at the fire for a moment. Then he smiled. I wouldn't mind. The words were simple, but Yuki went still beside him. She turned to look at him fully. The firelight danced in her blue eyes. Then, without a word, she wrapped both arms around him and hugged him tightly, resting her head against his shoulder. When she spoke, her voice was quiet and warm. I agree to that. Edward slipped an arm around her waist and held her close. For a while, they simply sat there together, listening to the crackling fire and the distant sound of wind through the pines. Then, because she was still herself, Yuki tilted her head up and gave him a teasing smile. Edward. He looked down at her. She narrowed her eyes playfully. You love me that much? There was no hesitation. Edward answered immediately. More than anything. Yuki's expression changed in an instant. The teasing softened into something deeper. She leaned up and kissed him gently, lingering for a moment in the firelight before resting her forehead against his. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I love you more than anything, too. The forest remained silent around them. Above the trees, one of the distant satellites crossed the night sky like a faint moving star, silently watching over their journey. And for that one quiet night, with the fire burning low and the world stretching unknown ahead of them, the frozen north could wait until morning. Morning came slowly in the northern wilderness. The first light of dawn filtered through the tall pines, turning the frost on the branches into glittering silver. The campfire had burned down to glowing embers, and the world around the small clearing was quiet except for the distant call of some mountain bird and the soft whisper of cold wind moving through the trees. Inside the insulated tent, Yuki woke first. For a moment, she stayed still beneath the blankets, listening to the quiet breathing beside her. Then she turned her head and smiled. Edward was still asleep on his back, one arm resting across the blanket, his expression relaxed in a way he rarely allowed himself when awake. The early sunlight through the tent wall cast a soft, pale glow across his face. Yuki propped herself up on one elbow and simply watched him for a while. Even after all these years, there were moments when she still looked at him and wondered how this strange human from another world had become the center of hers. Then, because she was absolutely incapable of leaving a peaceful moment alone, she grinned mischievously. Slowly, carefully, she shifted on top of the blanket and leaned over him. She draped both arms across his chest and brought her face close to his, only a few inches away, her nose nearly touching his. Then she waited. Her tail swished once beneath the blanket as she stared at him with shameless amusement. 5 seconds. 10. 20. Edward's breathing changed slightly. Yuki's smile widened. Then his eyes opened. For exactly 1 second, he looked confused. Then he focused on Yuki's face hovering right in front of his. Before he could even speak, she kissed him. A warm, gentle kiss that made his still sleepy expression soften instantly. When she pulled back, she was smiling. Good morning, my handsome husband. Edward blinked a few times, still waking up, then smiled in that quiet way that always made her heart melt. His voice was slightly rough with sleep. Good morning, my beautiful wife. Yuki's ears perked, and a teasing sparkle appeared in her eyes immediately. She rested her chin on his chest and smirked. Remember you said that when you see the beautiful elf girls. Edward laughed softly, still not moving, just enjoying the warmth of her lying half on top of him. I remember. She narrowed her eyes playfully. Good. Because if one of them smiles at you too much, I may challenge her to a duel. Edward raised an eyebrow. You're assuming they'd be interested. Yuki kissed his cheek. I'm not assuming. I've seen you. You're very stealable. That made him laugh enough that she looked pleased with herself. A little later, after breakfast and a quick check of the perimeter sensors, which had remained quiet all night, they packed the camp. The tent folded back into its compact cylinder, the security devices returned to Edward's pack, and within minutes the clearing looked untouched except for a faint circle in the snow where the fire had been. The robotic horses activated as soon as Edward approached, their blue eyes brightening as internal systems came online. Yuki mounted hers first, still humming cheerfully. As the machines lifted from the clearing and rose above the treetops, the endless northern landscape spread out beneath them, frozen rivers, ancient forests, and distant mountain ranges bathed in morning light. They flew in comfortable silence for nearly an hour, gliding over the world far below. Then Lucy's calm voice sounded through their communication earpieces. Update! I have identified the name of the city along your route. Yuki immediately perked up. Oh? A holographic marker appeared on Edward's wrist display. The city is called Eloria. Yuki blinked. Then she looked upward instinctively, as if trying to see the satellites above them. Lucy, you can even learn the names of cities? Lucy replied in her usual calm tone. Yes, Yuki. A slight pause. Then, with what almost sounded like dry humor. It makes identification easier when there is a large stone sign at the main road that says Welcome to Eloria. Yuki stared for a second. Then burst out laughing so suddenly her mechanical horse adjusted balance automatically. Edward smiled. Lucy's getting sarcastic. Lucy answered immediately. I learned from prolonged exposure to both of you. Yuki laughed even harder at that. The robotic horses continued north, rising higher as the terrain shifted. By midday, the forests began to thin. Ahead, the landscape transformed into something neither of them had expected. An immense silver forest stretched to the horizon, its trees towering hundreds of feet tall, their bark pale as moonlight, and their leaves shimmering like polished glass in the sun. Winding roads of white stone cut through the forest canopy. And at its center, visible even from miles away, rose the city of Eloria. It looked almost unreal. Great towers of pale crystal and white stone spiraled upward through the trees, connected by elegant bridges hanging between the upper branches. Waterfalls cascaded from elevated aqueducts into shimmering pools below. Sunlight reflected from hundreds of glass domes, making the entire city glow as if carved from frost and sunlight. Yuki stared openly. Her ears stood straight up. Then she looked at Edward. Her eyes narrowed slightly. All right. Edward already knew that tone. What? She pointed at the distant city. You were not allowed to be that handsome before we arrived here. Edward blinked. She crossed her arms. Because now I know the elf girls are going to notice. Edward laughed so hard his robotic horse gave a slight corrective tilt. Yuki moved her mount closer until it was nearly touching his in flight, and reached over to grab his arm again. Just to make her point clear. And together, they flew toward Eloria, unaware that their arrival was already being watched from one of the city's highest crystal towers. As the silver forests of Eloria drew closer, Edward slowed his robotic horse and glanced at Yuki. The city was breathtaking up close. Towering white stone walls rose between the giant silver trees, and crystal watchtowers gleamed in the afternoon sun. But even from the air, Edward had noticed something wrong. Sections of the outer wall were cracked. One of the western towers had been rebuilt recently, and several large impact marks scarred the main gate. He gestured toward a small clearing roughly 1,000 feet from the entrance. We land here. Yuki nodded. The robotic horses descended silently behind a stand of pale trees, their hooves touching the forest floor with barely a sound. Edward engaged their concealment mode, and both machines folded down into inactive standing positions, their alloy shells shifting color to blend with the shadows beneath the trees. Yuki patted hers affectionately. Stay hidden. Don't make friends with elf horses. Edward gave her a look. She grinned and adjusted her cloak. Together, they walked the remaining distance on foot. The white stone road curved gently through the silver forest until it reached an enormous carved archway. A polished stone sign stood beside the road in elegant script. "Welcome to Eloria." Yuki glanced at Edward with a smug smile. Lucy was right. As if on cue, Lucy's voice came softly through their earpieces. "I am correct approximately 99.8% of the time." Yuki smirked. "That means you're wrong sometimes." Lucy paused. "Yes. Usually when estimating how much trouble you two will cause." Edward actually laughed at that. But the moment they approached the main gate, the mood shifted. The elven guards atop the wall suddenly shouted. One pointed directly at them. The great gates began to open. And the nearest guard called down urgently. "Hurry! Get inside!" Edward and Yuki exchanged a quick look. Neither hesitated. They moved through the gate just as it began closing again behind them with a heavy groan of reinforced wood and steel. As the massive doors shut, Edward looked back and saw the damage more clearly. The gate itself was scarred by huge dents, sections of the outer wood had been splintered inward, and several massive rocks the size of wagons lay shattered near the base of the wall. Not siege weapons. Thrown. Edward's expression sharpened. A tall figure approached from the inner courtyard, flanked by several armored guards. The newcomer was unmistakably elven, well over 6 feet tall, slender but strong, with bronze-toned skin, silver hair braided behind his shoulders, and pointed ears extending through the sides of his helm. His armor was elegant white steel etched with green patterns like vines. He stopped before Edward and Yuki, studying them carefully. Not hostile. Just surprised. "I am Captain Milan," he said, voice calm but alert. Captain Milan. His eyes moved between them. "How did you get here without running into the ogres?" Edward frowned slightly. "What are the ogres?" The captain looked genuinely surprised. He glanced at Yuki, then back to Edward. "You are not from these lands?" It was not a question. Edward shook his head. "No." Captain Milan nodded and gestured toward the damaged gate. "The ogres are 15-foot mountain monsters. Brutish, thick-skinned, and strong enough to uproot trees. They eat smaller humanoids." Yuki's ears flattened slightly. The captain continued. "They came from the northern ranges 20 years ago. At first only a few. Then entire packs. They raid our roads, destroy caravans, and when they can, they take our people." His jaw tightened. "To eat them?" Edward's eyes narrowed. The captain looked at the gate. "So far, our walls have held. Barely. But trade has suffered, and many villages outside our walls were abandoned." He exhaled, as if forcing the grim thoughts aside. But enough of that. Now his gaze shifted to their armor. Edward and Yuki both wore their black dragonhide armor beneath their winter cloaks, smooth dark plates with faint silver edges that reflected light like obsidian. Captain Milan tilted his head. "What about you two? And how did you acquire black dragon armor?" His tone remained neutral. Curious, not accusatory. Yuki smiled slightly and glanced at Edward. Edward answered simply. "We killed the dragon." Silence. Every nearby guard stopped moving. Captain Milan stared at him for a long moment. Then blinked. Yuki added helpfully, almost too casually. "It was controlling orcs, lizard men, and several beast clans through some kind of mind domination." That made the captain's expression change entirely. He studied them again, as if seeing them for the first time. Then, slowly, he inclined his head. "We do not receive many humans or vulpine travelers here." His eyes lingered on Yuki's white fox ears. "But you are welcome in Eloria." He gestured toward the city. "I believe the elders will wish to meet you." A short time later, Edward and Yuki were escorted through the city. Eloria was even more beautiful inside the walls. White bridges arched over streams that ran through the streets. Crystal lamps hung from the branches of giant silver trees. Homes were built into living trunks, their balconies wrapped in flowering vines despite the northern cold. Yuki leaned close to Edward as they walked. Quietly, she whispered, "The elf women are very pretty." Edward sighed. I knew this was coming. She smirked. I'm just reminding you. Edward smiled despite himself. I'm married to the most dangerous woman in 2 continents. I'm not taking chances. That made her look extremely pleased. They were led into a vast circular hall grown directly from the trunk of a colossal tree, its interior carved into elegant chambers of polished wood and crystal. At the center sat 6 elders of Eloria. Each wore robes of white and silver, their expressions calm but sharp. Captain Milan bowed. Honored elders, these travelers came from the southern lands. They claim to have slain a black dragon. That got immediate attention. One elder leaned forward, her pale blue skin almost luminous in the chamber light. Elder Solara. A black dragon? Speak. Edward did. He explained everything. The dragon's mind control over the orcs. Its influence over lizard men and beast-like monsters. The attack on the human settlement years ago. The undead mage king. The raid on the town. And how each threat had been defeated and put down permanently. As he spoke, the elder's expressions grew more serious. When he finished, silence filled the chamber. The eldest among them, a silver-skinned elf with eyes like polished amber, finally spoke. High Elder Valor. His voice was quiet. The ogres appeared in our lands 20 years ago. He looked at the others. At first we believed them simple beasts. Then his eyes locked onto Edward. But if a dragon could control such creatures... He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Edward already understood. The room grew still. Then Lucy's voice sounded privately in Edward's earpiece, so quietly only he could hear. Satellite scan update. Multiple large heat signatures detected beyond Eloria's western forest. Estimated count 43. Edward's eyes narrowed slightly. Lucy continued. They are moving toward the city now. Yuki saw the subtle shift in his expression immediately. Her hand moved to her sword. The elders had not yet noticed. But outside, far beyond the white walls of Eloria, the ground had already begun to tremble. The moment Lucy's warning reached him, Edward stepped forward in the elder chamber, his voice calm but carrying enough force that every guard in the hall turned toward him. Elders, he said, meeting the gaze of High Elder Valor. We have incoming. Approximately 43 ogres will reach your walls soon. The chamber froze. Captain Milan reacted first. His hand went to the hilt of his curved blade. How could you possibly know that? Edward tapped the side of his earpiece but did not explain further. There isn't time. They're already moving through the western forest. Before anyone could respond, a deep horn sounded from outside. Then another. The warning bells of Eloria rang through the Crystal City. The guards in the chamber immediately turned and ran for the exits. Yuki's ears twitched, and a grin slowly spread across her face. She stepped beside Edward, already reaching for her sword. Then, almost at the same moment, both of them spoke. After this siege attempt, we'll fix your wall better than new. The synchronized statement made several elders blink in confusion. Yuki looked at Edward and laughed softly. My love, let's put this problem down for these good people. Edward smiled, and without hesitation answered. We got this, my beautiful wife. He leaned down and kissed her gently just behind one fox ear. Yuki's entire tail fluffed instantly. Several of the elven attendants pretended very hard not to notice. Yuki, entirely pleased with herself, slipped her hand into Edward's and snuggled close to his side for one brief moment, as if they were about to stroll through a garden instead of fight 43 giant man-eating monsters. Then she looked at the elders and smiled. Let us help, Elder. High Elder Valor stared at them both for a long second. Then, to Edward's surprise, the old elf slowly stood. There was no fear in his eyes now, only curiosity. If what you have said of dragons and undead kings is true, he inclined his head. Then Eloria accepts your aid with gratitude. Edward nodded once. That's enough. The western battlements were chaos. As Edward and Yuki climbed the broad stone stairs to the wall, the ground trembled with every distant impact. The ogres were coming. And when Edward reached the top of the wall and looked out over the silver forest, Even he had to pause. They were enormous. Each stood 15 feet tall or more, broad as wagons, with gray-green skin like cracked stone and massive tusked jaws. Many wore crude armor made from tree trunks, bone, and scavenged steel. Some carried entire uprooted trees as clubs. One of the largest bent down, lifted a boulder nearly the size of a cart, and hurled it at the wall. The stones struck with a thunderous crash. Fragments exploded outward, and several elven guards stumbled back. Yuki whistled softly. "Those are definitely bigger than orcs." Edward's expression remained calm. He slipped the staff from his back. The weapon hummed as internal systems came online. The nearest guards stepped away instinctively. Captain Lon arrived at their side, breathing hard. "There are too many. We can hold the wall, but they'll break the gate eventually." Edward handed him the molecular agitation gun. The captain looked at the strange weapon in confusion. "If any of them try to freeze or wedge the gate with ice or debris, point this and pull the trigger." The elf blinked. "What?" Edward was already stepping onto the wall parapet. "Just trust me." Captain Nolan stared as Edward stepped onto the very edge of the outer wall, looking down at the charging ogres. 300 feet below, the first of them reached the base. Yuki moved beside him, sword drawn, shield strapped to her arm. Then she leaned against him one last time and smiled. "Try not to look too handsome while saving the city." Edward laughed. "That's still your concern right now?" She grinned. "Yes." Then both of them jumped. The elven guards shouted in alarm. Captain Nolan rushed to the parapet and looked over the edge. Just in time to see Edward's black dragon armor flare blue as hidden gravitic systems slowed his descent. He landed like a meteor among the front line of ogres. The impact alone cracked the frozen earth. Before the nearest creature could even react, Edward swung his staff. The weapon connected with the ogre's leg. A deafening boom echoed across the battlefield. The creature's lower body simply disappeared into a spray of blood, shattered bone, and flying snow as the staff's 10-ton impact multiplied through inertia. The remaining upper half spun through the air and crashed into two other ogres, knocking them flat. For one impossible second, the battlefield went silent. Then Yuki landed beside him. Her shield slammed into the chest of the nearest charging ogre. A repulsion wave exploded outward. 5 monsters were hurled backward at once, flying nearly 10 feet before smashing into the snow hard enough to leave trenches in the earth. The elven guards on the wall could only stare. Captain Nolan whispered hoarsely, "What in the stars are they?" Edward spun his staff and struck another ogre across the chest. The inertia amplification triggered. The monster flew backward like it had been hit by a siege engine, crashing through 3 trees before it stopped moving. Yuki darted beneath a giant swinging club, leapt onto a fallen boulder, and sliced upward. Her sword passed through the ogre's arm, shoulder, and torso in one fluid strike. The upper half slid apart before the lower half had even fallen. She landed lightly in the snow and looked back toward the wall. Then waved cheerfully. The ogres roared in confusion. The people of Eloria watched from the battlements in stunned silence. And far above the battlefield, one of Edward's satellites adjusted its orbit, recording everything while Lucy's calm voice whispered in his ear. "Correction. 43 ogres was initial count." A brief pause. "Additional 21 emerging from the western tree line." Edward looked toward the forest. More massive shapes were crashing through the silver trees. Yuki saw them too. Her ears perked. And instead of concern, she smiled wider. "Oh good." She raised her shield. "I was worried that was all of them." The battlefield outside Eloria had become a storm of shattered snow, broken trees, and falling giants. Edward drove his staff into the side of another ogre's knee, and the crack of impact sounded like a cannon shot. The 15-foot creature collapsed sideways, taking 2 of its own kind down with it as the inertia multiplier pulsed through the blow. Beside him, Yuki moved like white lightning across the snow. Her black dragon armor flashed in the winter sun as she ducked under a tree-sized club, stepped inside an ogre's guard, and drove her shield into its abdomen. The repulsion field detonated. The monster left the ground entirely, smashing into another behind it so hard both were hurled backward through the snow and a tangled heap of limbs and broken bone. As they fought, Edward saw the second group of 21 ogres emerging from the western tree-line. They were moving fast, drawn by the sounds of battle. He glanced up toward the wall and shouted to Captain Milan. "Captain? Use the weapon I lent you on the new 21." The captain was still staring at the carnage below, half convinced he had somehow fallen into a fever dream. Edward shouted again, louder. "The weapon will boil their blood instantly and make them explode. It's messy, but it works." Several elven guards nearby turned pale. Edward pointed with his staff while crushing another ogre's ankle under a single strike. "It works like a crossbow. Point and pull the trigger. We'll be there soon." Captain Milan looked down at the strange weapon in his hands. Then at the advancing ogres. Then back at Edward, who had just knocked one giant's head clean off with a swing that sent it tumbling into the snow like a boulder. The captain swallowed once. Then aimed. The molecular agitation gun hummed softly, its front lens glowing blue. The nearest ogre, a massive brute carrying half a pine tree as a club, looked up toward the wall and roared. Captain Milan pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. For 1 second. Then 2. The ogre stopped mid-stride. Its skin turned bright red. Its eyes widened in confusion. And then it exploded. A wet thunderclap echoed across the battlefield as the creature came apart in a cloud of blood, bone fragments, and steam. Chunks of ogre rained across the snow. Silence fell over the battlements. One elven archer slowly lowered his bow. Another whispered, "By the stars!" Captain Milan stared at the weapon in his hands. Then, very carefully, aimed at the next ogre. His expression changed. A slow, dangerous smile appeared. "Oh!" He pulled the trigger again. Another ogre exploded. This one showered 2 others in steaming gore, causing the rest of the incoming group to hesitate for the first time. The captain raised the weapon and shouted to his guards. "Clear the wall! This thing is absurd!" The elven soldiers scrambled out of his way immediately. Below, Edward and Yuki were still cutting through the first wave. The original 43 ogres had surrounded them at first, but it quickly became obvious that numbers meant very little when each of the 2 travelers could kill a giant with a single hit. Edward planted one foot, twisted, and swung his staff horizontally. The weapon struck one ogre in the ribs. The 10-ton force multiplied instantly. The creature was launched sideways like a thrown stone, crashing into a cluster of 4 others and flattening all of them beneath its own bulk. Yuki laughed as she vaulted onto the back of another ogre. It tried to grab her. She stabbed her sword through its shoulder into its neck, slid down its back as it collapsed, then turned and sliced through another's club mid-swing. The blade didn't just cut the wood. It passed through the club, the ogre's wrists, and halfway through its torso before she finished the motion. She looked over at Edward, grinning breathlessly. "I like this city." Edward smashed an ogre's kneecap and replied calmly. "You like every city where things try to kill us." She beamed. "That's because those are the interesting ones." The battle raged on. The ogres had size and strength, but they lacked discipline. And against 2 opponents with impossible technology, dragonhide armor, and weapons far beyond anything in this world, they never had a chance. Within half an hour, the snow outside the walls was stained dark red. Within 40 minutes, the remaining ogres began to panic. Several tried to flee. Yuki chased them. Edward did not bother stopping her. By the time nearly an hour had passed, the first wave of 43 ogres was gone. All of them. The battlefield fell silent except for the cold wind moving through the silver trees. Edward stood in the snow, staff resting on one shoulder, his breath visible in the frozen air. Around him lay the remains of shattered clubs, broken trees, and enormous bodies. Yuki walked back toward him, brushing blood off her shield with one gloved hand. Her white hair had come partly loose from its tie, and there was a small smear of red across one cheek. She looked entirely too happy. She reached him, slipped her arm around his, and leaned against him like they had just finished a pleasant walk instead of an ogre massacre. I think the elf guards are scared of us now. Edward glanced up at the wall. She was right. Every guard on the battlements was staring down in complete silence. Captain Milan stood at the gate with the molecular agitation guns still in hand. At his feet were the remains of 7 exploded ogres from the second group. He looked at Edward. Then at the weapon. Then back at Edward. And for the first time since they met, the composed captain looked completely speechless. Lucy's voice chimed into Edward's earpiece. Update! The remaining 14 from the second group have halted and are retreating west. Yuki's ears perked. She looked up at Edward and smiled. Should we help the captain finish those 2? Edward looked toward the retreating giants disappearing into the distant forest. Then at Yuki, who was already bouncing slightly on her feet like she wanted an excuse to chase them. He smiled. Yes. And before the elven guards could even process what they were seeing, Edward wrapped one arm around Yuki's waist, activated the gravitic systems in their armor. And both of them shot into the air after the fleeing ogres like black comets over the snow. The last of the fleeing ogres never made it far. Across the silver forest west of Eloria, Edward and Yuki moved like shadows through the snow. The remaining 14 had tried to run deeper into the woods, crashing through the massive silver trees in blind panic. It did not help. Edward's staff shattered trunks and bone alike with every swing, each impact sending tremors through the frozen ground. Yuki was even faster, darting between the towering creatures and cutting them down before they could even turn to face her. Within 20 minutes, the forest was silent again. The only sounds were the wind through the silver leaves and Yuki brushing snow from her cloak. She walked back toward Edward, smiling as if they had just finished an afternoon game. Well, she said, sliding her hand into his. That solved their ogre problem. Edward glanced at the distant city walls visible through the trees. For now. Yuki squeezed his hand and leaned into him. For now is still a good start. Together they returned to Eloria. The great gates were already open when they approached. This time, no one shouted in alarm. Instead, the guards lining the wall stood in stunned silence. Many had removed their helmets. A few bowed their heads as Edward and Yuki passed. The snow outside the city was still stained red, and the broken remains of the siege lay scattered across the field. Elven workers had already begun clearing the bodies, but many paused just to stare at the 2 travelers walking calmly back through the gate. Captain Milan was waiting for them just inside. He still held the molecular agitation gun carefully in both hands, like it might explode if he breathed wrong. As Edward approached, the captain returned the weapon grip first. I believe this belongs to you. Edward took it. The captain looked between Edward and Yuki, then gave a respectful bow, not to nobility, but to warriors. The elders wish to speak with you again. Yuki smiled. Hopefully this time it's not because more giant things want to eat them. Captain Milan almost smiled. I suspect this meeting is different. The elder chamber was quieter than before. The 6 elders sat in the same semicircle within the giant living hall, but the atmosphere had changed entirely. No suspicion. No guarded curiosity. Only solemn focus. At the center of the chamber, resting on a carved pedestal of pale wood, lay an ancient book. Its cover was made of dark silver leather, cracked with age, and bound with metal clasps etched in a script Edward did not recognize. As Edward and Yuki entered, the elders rose to their feet. Even Captain Milan stopped near the entrance, and remained silent. High Elder Vela looked at them for a long moment. Then he looked down at the ancient book. His voice was calm, but there was unmistakable awe in it. When our city was founded, long before the ogres came, a prophet recorded a warning. He opened the book carefully. The pages were thin, almost translucent, filled with elegant writing and painted illustrations faded by centuries. One elder turned the book so Edward and Yuki could see. There, painted in old ink, were 2 figures standing before a city of white towers. One was clearly human. The other had fox ears and a tail. Yuki froze. Her hand tightened around Edward's. The chamber was utterly silent. High Elder Vela read from the page. There shall come a time when the Silver City stands in shadow, and a strong enemy shall bring the people to the edge of ruin. His eyes rose to meet Edward's. In that hour, 2 travelers shall arrive from distant lands. He looked toward Yuki. One human. One vulpine. Captain Milan inhaled sharply. The elder continued. The heroes shall bear the strongest of armor, dark as the void beyond the stars, and wield the strongest of weapons. His expression shifted as he read the old words. Weapons the prophet called the nightmares of monsters. At that, every elder looked at Edward's staff. Then at Yuki's sword and shield. Yuki whispered under her breath. That is actually a very cool title. Edward tried very hard not to laugh. The elder turned another page. The illustration showed the 2 figures standing atop a mountain, behind them a world encircled by stars. His voice grew quieter. And the people shall not fear them, for they are not bringers of destruction. He looked directly at Edward and Yuki. They are the guardians of the world. The room went completely still. Yuki looked up at Edward, her blue eyes wide for once. Then, because she was still herself, she smiled faintly and leaned against his arm. She whispered just loudly enough for him to hear. World Guardian sounds much better than Sky Egg Maker. Edward laughed despite the weight of the moment. That small laugh seemed to break the tension. High Elder Valor smiled for the first time. Then he bowed. Not a simple nod. A full, formal bow from the waist. The other elders followed. Then Captain Milan. And finally every attendant in the chamber. The oldest city in the northern forests was bowing to them. Edward immediately raised a hand. That's not necessary. High Elder Valor straightened. For us it is. He gently closed the ancient book. For 20 years, our people believed the prophecy was symbolic. A story to give hope in hard times. His gaze moved toward the door, where distant bells still rang as the city celebrated the defeat of the ogres. But today, 2 strangers arrived from the sky, wearing black dragon armor and carrying weapons no monster could withstand. He smiled faintly. The old words were true. Yuki squeezed Edward's hand and rested her head lightly against his shoulder. Then she looked at the elders and said with complete sincerity, We're just travelers trying to help. High Elder Valor's expression softened. Then perhaps that is why the prophecy chose you. The elder paused. Then his face grew serious again. He opened the book to one final page. This illustration was different. It showed a frozen mountain. Beneath it, deep under the ice, was a great glowing structure. Edward's breath caught. The elder touched the image with one long finger. The prophecy did not end with the city. The room became silent once more. High Elder Valor looked directly at Edward. It says the world guardians will come when the gate beneath the frozen mountain begins to awaken. The elder chamber fell silent after High Elder Valor revealed the final illustration. A frozen mountain. A glowing structure beneath it. And words that matched far too closely with what Edward had already discovered through the satellites. Edward stepped closer to the ancient book, studying the faded page. Then he looked at the elder. Do you know where the gate is? High Elder Valor rested one hand on the old parchment. There is only a hint. His voice was quiet. He read from the page. It says that the eyes of the world would be able to find the entrance, and that the guardians would be able to open it. For a brief second, no one spoke. Then Lucy's voice sounded in Edward's earpiece, calm as ever. I believe the hint refers to me and the orbital survey network. Yuki smiled immediately. Lucy figured it out before we did. Edward wasn't surprised. Lucy continued. Cross-referencing the prophecy description with current satellite scans. I have located a probable entrance. A holographic projection appeared above Edward's wrist. The room filled with blue light as a section of frozen mountains materialized in miniature. A ridge. A glacier. A narrow canyon. Then the image zoomed in. A massive wall of ice stood against the side of a mountain, perfectly natural at first glance. But as the skin layers shifted, the illusion vanished. Behind the camouflaged ice was a hollow void. Lucy's voice remained precise. Hidden cave detected. Entrance dimensions approximately 30 feet high by 39 feet wide. Ice formation has been deliberately shaped to appear natural from exterior observation. The image expanded further. Beyond the ice was a cavern so large it dwarfed the city hall. And from it stretched several branching pathways deep into the mountain. Even the elders stared at the hologram in amazement. One of them whispered in Elvish under his breath. Yuki looked at Edward and grinned. Well, that seems suspiciously convenient. Edward folded his arms. It confirms the prophecy was based on something real. Yuki nodded. Then she turned back to the elders and raised one finger. To start, Edward has several construction formulas that would help the city's defenses. The elders immediately looked interested. Yuki raised a second finger. And two, is there a place where we can get cleaned up, eat, and have a good night's sleep? She smiled sweetly. Then tomorrow, we will look into the problem that is 1,500 miles north. That got the first genuine laugh from the elders. High Elder Vaylor closed the book and smiled. Guardian Yuki. Guardian Edward. Yuki blinked. Then whispered to Edward. I still like that title. The elder continued. There is an empty home in Eloria that shall be yours. Edward began to protest, but Vaylor gently raised his hand. Not merely because of your title. His expression grew solemn. But because of what you did for our people this day. He bowed his head slightly. Consider yourselves honorary citizens of Eloria. Yuki's ears stood upright. Then she smiled warmly. That is very kind. High Elder Vaylor stepped away from the council circle. His long silver robes brushed the polished wood floor. I will show you your new home away from home. The house stood near the upper terraces of Eloria, built into the side of one of the colossal silver trees that formed the city's center. As they followed the elder through the twilight streets, lanterns of crystal and living moss lit the pathways in soft green-blue light. Elven citizens watched from balconies and bridges overhead, whispering as the two strangers passed. Not with fear. With wonder. The home itself was beautiful. It had been carved directly into a massive living tree, its walls a blend of pale wood and white stone, with tall curved windows overlooking the silver forest. A stream ran beneath a small crystal bridge leading to the front door, and flowering vines climbed along the railings despite the northern cold. High Elder Vaylor opened the door and stepped aside. The inside was warm, lit by gentle floating lanterns. A central hearth glowed softly. There were thick woven rugs, polished wooden furniture, a large bath chamber fed by heated spring water, and an upstairs loft bedroom overlooking the forest. Yuki stepped inside and immediately stopped. Her tail swished happily. She looked at Edward with wide eyes. This is nicer than our first house. Edward laughed softly. That's true. The elder smiled faintly. Food will be brought shortly. Fresh clothing as well. Rest tonight. Tomorrow, we can discuss your construction ideas for the wall. Edward nodded respectfully. I can reinforce the main gate, create impact dispersal support columns, and install hidden defensive systems. It won't take long. Vaylor looked at him for a moment, still not fully understanding what half of those words meant. Then he simply nodded. Then Eloria is fortunate. As he turned to leave, he paused at the doorway. And his voice became serious again. The gate beneath the frozen mountain has been part of our oldest stories. He looked back at them. Our ancestors warned never to seek it. The room grew still. Vaylor's eyes lingered on Edward. But if the prophecy has awakened now, perhaps it waited for you. Then he left. The door closed quietly. Silence settled in the home. For a moment, neither Edward nor Yuki spoke. Then Yuki slowly turned in a circle, taking in the room. Then she looked upstairs. Then at the bath chamber. Then back at Edward. A mischievous smile spread across her face. We should definitely investigate the bath before the food arrives. Edward raised an eyebrow. That's your first priority. She walked over, wrapped both arms around his neck, and smiled up at him. My first priority is spending one night in our beautiful elf house with my handsome husband before we go open an ancient frozen gate that everyone says should stay closed. Edward laughed, slipping his arms around her waist. That's a fair argument. She kissed him once, quick and warm. Then took his hand and started pulling him toward the bath chamber. At that exact moment, Lucy chimed in through his earpiece. Additional note, I have also detected structural weak points in Eloria's western wall. I can assist with redesign plans. Yuki looked up at Edward and grinned. Lucy can wait 10 minutes. Lucy paused. Then answered, perfectly calm. Statistically unlikely. Edward burst out laughing as Yuki dragged him upstairs anyway. The warm water of the bathing chamber slowly faded into steam as Edward and Yuki finished washing away the remnants of battle, travel, and ogre blood. The bath itself had been carved into the heart of their new home in Eloria, a natural spring guided through enchanted stone channels, glowing faintly with soft green light from embedded crystals. When they finally stepped out, both of them were wrapped in towels, hair damp, skin warm from the heat. Yuki stretched with a satisfied sigh. Oh stars, that was nice. Edward nodded as he adjusted his towel. That was very nice. I agree. Yuki turned toward him with a playful grin, water still dripping from her fox ears. And remember, she said, leaning in just slightly, you are mine. Edward looked at her for a moment, then smiled. And you are mine. That made her tail flick happily behind her. They stood in the bedroom afterward, the warm air inside their elven home wrapped around them like a blanket. Soft lantern light cast gentle gold tones across the carved wooden walls. Yuki began pulling on the prepared elven garments left for them, light, well-fitted clothing of soft white fabric with subtle silver embroidery. As she dressed, she glanced over her shoulder at Edward. And don't forget, she said with mock seriousness, no touching beautiful elf girls. Edward paused mid-step, then shook his head slightly as he put on his tunic. As pretty as the elf girls are, he said calmly, none of them come close to my beautiful wife. Yuki froze for half a second, then smiled very smugly. That is the correct answer. A knock came at the door. Yuki immediately perked up. I'll get it. She opened the door to find 3 elves standing respectfully outside. One carried a steaming pot filled with aromatic stew, rich with herbs and warm spice. The second held freshly baked bread wrapped in cloth. The third carried a carefully wrapped ceremonial box. All 3 bowed slightly. Welcome, honored guests, one of them said gently. Citizens of Eloria, and guardians. Yuki blinked, then stepped aside. Please come in. The elves entered quietly, setting the food down on a small wooden table near the hearth. The woman carrying the ceremonial box stepped forward and presented it with both hands. This is for you, she said. Yuki and Edward exchanged a glance, then carefully opened it together. Inside were 2 necklaces. They were made of polished silver and deep blue crystal, etched with flowing elven script that shimmered faintly even in low light. Edward lifted one slightly. The writing seemed almost alive, shifting as if it were part of the metal itself. The elf woman spoke softly. These necklaces are over 6,000 years old. Yuki's ears twitched. They were kept in our oldest vaults, waiting for the guardians. Edward looked up slightly. Waiting? The elf woman nodded. For you. Yuki and Edward both paused. Then, almost instinctively, they put the necklaces on. The moment the clasps closed, both crystals emitted a soft pulse of light. A gentle glow spread outward for just a second before settling into a steady, faint shimmer against their chests. The elf woman smiled. That glow is further proof. She looked between them. You are the guardians. Then she turned slightly toward the door. I will report this to the elders immediately. Before leaving, she paused. Keep them always. They are more than symbols. Her expression became serious. They are a badge of authority. Most cities that still remember the old world will recognize them. Yuki touched hers lightly. It feels warm. The elf woman nodded. It will respond to you in time. Then she smiled faintly. You both look very nice in elven clothing. Yuki grinned. Thank you. Edward gave a polite nod. The elves began preparing the meal. The stew filled the room with a rich, comforting scent as it was ladled into bowls. The woman gestured toward it. Please. Eat. It is a local delicacy. Yuki immediately sat down. Edward followed. They both took a bite at the exact same time. A brief pause. Then Yuki's eyes widened. Edward blinked once. That's really good. Yuki nodded rapidly. Very good. The elf attendants smiled in quiet satisfaction. For the first time since arriving, there was no urgency, no alarms, no battles. Just warmth, food, and the crackle of the hearth. Eventually, the elves departed with polite bows, leaving the house quiet once more. The door clicked shut. Yuki leaned back in her chair and sighed happily. I could live here. Edward smiled slightly. I think we are, at least for now. Yuki stood, walked over, and gently took his hand. Come on. He looked at her. She tilted her head toward the stairs. Bed. He didn't argue. The bedroom upstairs was even more comfortable than the rest of the house. Large, softly lit, with thick blankets and a wide carved wooden bed positioned beneath a window overlooking the glowing silver forest. Outside, Eloria shimmered under moonlight. Inside, everything was quiet. Edward and Yuki lay down together beneath the warm blankets, side by side. Yuki immediately curled closer, resting her head against his shoulder. Edward wrapped an arm around her without hesitation. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Yuki whispered softly, Tomorrow we go north again. Edward nodded slightly. Yes. She smiled faintly in the dark. But tonight. She snuggled closer. We sleep. Edward kissed the top of her head gently. Yeah. Their breathing slowly synchronized. Outside, the city of Eloria rested in peace for the first time in a long while. And inside the ancient forest, 2 guardians finally slept well. During the night, while the silver city of Eloria slept beneath moonlit branches, both Edward and Yuki dreamed the same dream. Neither knew it at first. But when they woke, both would remember every detail. They stood in an immense chamber unlike anything either had seen. It stretched farther than sight, row upon row of towering shelves carved from black stone and crystal, filled with books, scrolls, tablets, and strange glowing objects suspended in the air. Bridges of light crossed between the shelves, and above them the ceiling resembled a night sky filled not with stars, but moving symbols and constellations of written language. It felt less like a library, more like a repository of the world's memory. At the center of the endless hall stood an ancient elf. He was impossibly old, his silver hair reaching nearly to the floor, his robes woven from cloth that shimmered like starlight. His skin was pale gold, and his eyes looked older than cities. He leaned on a staff made from polished whitewood. And he was waiting. When Edward and Yuki approached in the dream, the old elf smiled. A calm, knowing smile. He bowed his head. And spoke only one sentence. The repository has waited for the guardians. Then the dream ended. Morning came gently. Golden light streamed through the curved bedroom windows, casting long beams across the wooden floor. Yuki woke first, as she almost always did. She stayed still for a moment, her head resting on Edward's shoulder, listening to his breathing. Then she remembered the dream. She blinked, slowly lifted her head, and noticed Edward was still asleep. A mischievous smile immediately appeared. She stayed very still, thinking. Then her fox ears perked. An idea! Carefully, she leaned over him, brushed his hair aside, and lightly bit the side of his neck. Just enough to surprise him. Edward's eyes opened instantly. His hand moved halfway toward the side table before he realized he was in bed and not under attack. He blinked up at Yuki. What was that? Yuki was already trying not to laugh. She failed. She covered her mouth with one hand, giggling. I was showing affection. Edward narrowed his eyes slightly. Yuki grinned wider. Like Petra does to Eric. That made Edward stare for a second. Then he laughed despite himself. Yuki rolled onto her side beside him, still smiling. I think it's so cute that Petra likes our Eric so much. Edward sat up slightly against the headboard. He's going to be confused for years. Yuki nodded cheerfully. Probably. Then she leaned her chin on his shoulder and added with complete seriousness. But she's strong, smart, and she bites people she likes. That's commitment. Edward shook his head. Oh? He turned toward her, smiling faintly. Then here's how I'll show affection to you. Before Yuki could answer, Edward leaned closer and kissed gently just behind one of her fox ears. Exactly where he had kissed her the previous day. Yuki froze. Her ears twitched. Then her tail puffed and curled around his waist under the blanket. She looked entirely too pleased. A slow smile spread across her face. You remembered? Edward smirked. You looked like you enjoyed it yesterday. Yuki leaned into him and kissed his cheek. I definitely did. After they got dressed in their travel clothes and armor once more, Edward reheated the remaining elven stew from the night before using a small thermal plate from his pack. The rich smell filled the kitchen as they ate at the wooden table near the window. Yuki tore apart the remaining bread and dipped it into the stew, humming happily. This is still delicious. Edward nodded. Definitely worth keeping the recipe. Yuki's ears perked. You should get it from them before we leave. Edward smiled. I was already thinking that. After breakfast, they packed their belongings. Their weapons were checked. Armor secured. The guardian necklaces rested beneath their cloaks, still faintly warm against their chests. Before heading out to their hidden robotic mounts beyond the city, they stopped once more at the Elder Hall. This time the doors were already open. The elders seemed to have expected them. High Elder Valor stood near the entrance, holding the ancient book closed in his hands. When he saw them, he smiled. You both dreamed, did you not? Edward stopped. Yuki looked up sharply. Neither had said anything. Edward's voice was calm but careful. How did you know? Valor's expression became unreadable. He touched the ancient book lightly. Because every guardian before you dreamed of the repository before reaching the frozen gate. Yuki's ears slowly lowered. Edward's eyes narrowed. The old elf. That made Valor nod once. The curator. Silence settled around them. The elder looked between the two travelers. The place you seek in the mountain is not merely a ruin. He lowered his voice. It is a threshold. Yuki instinctively moved closer to Edward, slipping her hand into his. Valor saw but did not comment. Instead, he stepped forward and placed a hand gently over the necklaces hidden beneath their cloaks. The path ahead may show you truths forgotten by the world. He stepped back. But you will not walk it alone. Eloria stands with you. Edward inclined his head respectfully. Thank you. Yuki smiled warmly. And we'll come back after we investigate. Valor smiled faintly. I believe you will. As they turned to leave, the elder spoke one final time. Guardians. They paused. He looked toward the northern horizon visible beyond the hall windows. And for the first time, there was worry in his ancient eyes. When the gate opens, he tightened his grip on the old book. Whatever wakes beyond it may remember why it was sealed. The morning wind stirred the silver branches outside. Edward and Yuki exchanged one quiet look. Then, without fear, they walked toward the city gates and the hidden mounts beyond. The north was waiting. Thank you for listening. Part 4 coming soon. Please like and subscribe if you liked the story,